The house on Sycamore Lane was more than just a home, it was a sanctuary recently adapted to accommodate the life-changing needs of Governor Clara Vance. After a sudden, debilitating accident that necessitated the use of a wheelchair, the house required immediate, necessary modifications. The most critical change was the installation of a permanent, structurally sound, and code-compliant wheelchair ramp leading from the garage to the front door. Clara's brother, Michael, had overseen the construction, ensuring the ramp was built with high-quality, weather-treated lumber, painted to match the exterior trim, a necessary piece of infrastructure that adhered strictly to the Americans with Disabilities Act HOA guidelines, preempting the local building codes with federal mandate. The ramp was finished swiftly, designed for utility and safety, an undeniable necessity for the chief executive of the state. However, the governor's residency was in the highly regulated, aesthetically manicured community of Grandview Acres, a place where architectural conformity was enforced with the rigid discipline of a military barracks. The Grandview Acres Homeowners Association HOA, led by its notoriously petty and self-important chairman, Victor Sterling, viewed the ramp not as a life-affirming necessity, but as a glaring, unacceptable violation of their architectural harmony and exterior standards. Victor, a retired insurance adjuster whose life was now centered entirely on wielding his HOA authority, had an almost pathological aversion to anything that disrupted the neighborhood's visual uniformity. The ramp, despite being painted the correct color, jutted out slightly beyond the established 5-foot setback, a deviation Victor found unconscionable. Michael, knowing the challenges of dealing with the Grandview Acres HOA, had proactively submitted the plans for the ramp, complete with the physician's necessity report and a detailed explanation of the HOA compliance requirements. The application was met not with approval, but with bureaucratic delay and obfuscation. Victor, in a series of increasingly arrogant and convoluted emails, insisted the ramp was too prominent, suggested the governor should use a portable, temporary ramp that could be stored after each use, and demanded a detailed study on how the ramp's visual mass could be mitigated with approved evergreen screening. Michael, busy managing his sister's recovery and the immense pressures of her office, tried to reason with Victor, repeatedly citing the HOA, explaining that a permanent structure was required for safety and accessibility. Victor simply dismissed the federal law, declaring it not applicable to private, residential covenants. The tension peaked when Victor, seizing on the lack of final written approval, delivered a scathing final compliance notice to Michael. The notice declared the ramp a gross, unapproved structural deviation and demanded its complete removal within 48 hours. The penalty for non-compliance was stated as immediate, HOA commissioned remedial action and full assessment of costs. Michael immediately contacted the HOA's lawyer, who confirmed the HOA had absolutely no legal ground to stand on given the HOA, but warned that Victor was prone to acting impulsively and recklessly before consulting legal counsel. Victor, fueled by his self-importance and a singular desire to prove the HOA's authority superseded everything, even the governor of the state, whose identity he deliberately overlooked in his zeal, saw the ramp as a trophy of his power. He knew Governor Vance resided there, but he chose to see her only as the non-compliant resident on Sycamore Lane. Her political office was irrelevant to his petty mandate. He decided that demonstrating the HOA's unyielding authority was more important than waiting for a court order or even consulting the city's building department. He wanted a public display of dominance to quell any other resident who might consider violating his rigid standards. The day the 48-hour deadline expired, Victor didn't wait. He called a local landscaping contractor he often used for community projects, misleading them into believing the ramp was a piece of unapproved, illegal construction that needed immediate demolition under HOA mandate. Michael was away at the Capitol helping Clara with a critical policy briefing. He returned that afternoon to a sight that made his blood run cold, a small bobcat excavator sitting in the driveway, and the governor's custom-built, essential wheelchair ramp reduced to a pile of splintered wood and twisted metal lying on the grass. Victor Sterling was standing triumphantly nearby, clipboard in hand, supervising the demolition with a cruel, self-satisfied smirk, the picture of petty power fully unleashed. The necessary lifeline for a high-ranking state official, a structure protected by federal law, had been violently and willfully destroyed over a subjective grievance about its appearance. The political and legal fallout was about to be biblical. Michael returned to a scene of senseless, aggressive vandalism. The sight of the splintered lumber and the small bobcat excavator sitting in the driveway, its metal claws resting near the foundation where the ramp had been, filled him with a cold, intense fury. He didn't have to search for the perpetrator. Victor Sterling, the HOA chairman, stood nearby, radiating a triumphant, smug arrogance, his clipboard clutched like a scepter of demolition. Victor approached Michael with a victorious air. "Remedial action has been completed, Mr. Vance," he announced, his voice tight with satisfaction. "The structure was a gross violation. We will now assess the full cost of the demolition, plus an administrative fee, to your account. This sends a clear message about compliance." Michael stood for a long moment, not speaking, simply absorbing the totality of the destruction and the sheer, unforgivable arrogance of the man responsible. His sister, the sitting governor of the state, was due home in 2 hours, and the essential means for her safe access had been violently eliminated. He pulled out his phone, not to argue, but to document. He took detailed photographs of the ruined ramp, the excavator, and finally, Victor himself. Victor posed, actually preening for the camera, clearly convinced he was capturing a proud moment of HOA victory. "I suggest you look into a temporary solution, Mr. Vance," Victor patronized, "something less permanent and disruptive to the aesthetic harmony." The critical turning point came when Michael finally made the necessary call. He phoned Clara's chief of staff, Mark, at the Capitol. His voice, though controlled, carried a chilling urgency. "Mark, Victor Sterling and the Grandview Acres HOA just demolished the governor's wheelchair ramp. They used heavy equipment. It's rubble in the driveway." The line went silent for a beat before Mark responded, the professionalism in his voice immediately sharpening. "Demolished over what authority?" Michael explained the aesthetic violation pretext and Victor's complete disregard for the ADA. Mark immediately understood the gravity. This wasn't just property damage, this was a deliberate attack on a federally protected civil right, perpetrated against the state's highest elected official, making it a catastrophic political and legal incident. Mark informed the governor instantly. Clara Vance, a woman known for her calm demeanor in crisis, was initially silent, then simply said, "Find out who authorized the contractor and freeze every non-essential allocation that passes through the Department of Community Affairs into Grandview Acres. Get the ADA compliance attorney on the phone and file a police report with the state troopers for destruction of state critical access infrastructure." The response was calculated, institutional, and swift. This was no longer a neighbor dispute, this was an executive response to a hostile act. Meanwhile, back at Sycamore Lane, Victor was still basking in his victory, gloating to a nearby resident. He failed to notice the arrival of a sleek, black sedan pulling up behind Michael's truck. Out stepped 2 men in dark suits and earpieces, state troopers assigned to the governor's protective detail, who had been alerted by the chief of staff. They were followed by a second car containing Mark himself, clutching a folder of official documents. Victor, seeing the formal presence, straightened, adjusting his tie, assuming they were coming to commend his enforcement action. Mark approached Victor, his expression utterly cold. "Mr. Sterling, I am Mark Nolan, Chief of Staff to Governor Vance." He watched as Victor's face finally registered the full, terrifying implications of the name. Victor's smugness dissolved, replaced by a dawning comprehension of the enormous mistake he had made. The governor of the entire state was the non-compliant resident whose federally protected property he had just destroyed. "The governor, she lives here," Victor stammered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Mark ignored the question and spoke with chilling clarity. "You willfully ordered the destruction of a medically essential, HOA-compliant structure on private property. This act will be treated as an assault on the civil rights of a disabled citizen and a deliberate act of malice against the property of the sitting chief executive of the state." Mark gestured to the state troopers. "You are required to provide a full statement regarding the contractor and the authorization for this demolition. Any refusal will result in immediate arrest for obstruction." The sight of the state troopers, the official seal of the governor's office, and the sheer gravity of the words finally crushed Victor's petty authority. He crumpled, his clipboard falling from his grasp. The reality was blindingly apparent: he hadn't won a victory over a non-compliant resident, he had declared war on the state government over a few feet of lumber. The /350 fine he was trying to assess was about to be dwarfed by the massive, multi-million-dollar legal and political reckoning he had just unleashed upon himself and the entire Grandview Acres community. The humiliation of Victor Sterling was swift, public, and absolute, but it was merely the opening salvo in a calculated institutional response orchestrated by the state government. The realization that he had ordered the destruction of essential access infrastructure belonging to the sitting governor reduced Victor to a quivering mess, utterly incapable of defending his reckless actions. The state troopers, after taking his statement and confirming the deliberate nature of the demolition, were meticulously professional. They did not arrest him on the spot, but they ensured every detail necessary for legal action was secured. The immediate aftermath involved not just police reports, but a flurry of activity from the highest levels of state government, turning the petty HOA dispute into a federal-level civil rights and political crisis. Governor Vance's chief of staff, Mark Nolan, wasted no time. The first action taken was filing a formal complaint under the Americans with Disabilities Act (HOA) with the Department of Justice. This instantly transformed the issue from a local property dispute into a federal civil rights violation, bypassing the slow, often corruptible local courts. The DOJ's involvement meant that the HOA board members, and specifically Victor Sterling, faced personal liability and massive punitive damages that would quickly bankrupt them, regardless of their insurance coverage. Concurrently, the governor's legal counsel filed a police report with the state troopers for felony vandalism and reckless endangerment, given the destruction of essential medical access. The second, and perhaps most effective, blow came from Governor Vance's executive authority. As the chief executive, she controlled the state budget and the allocation of funds that flowed through various agencies to local municipalities and special districts, a category that often included HOA-style community improvement districts. The Grandview Acres community benefited from state funding for infrastructure grants, road maintenance assistance, and even specific environmental and community improvement funds designed to enhance neighborhoods. Governor Vance signed an executive order, precisely and legally targeting the HOA. The order didn't directly mention the ramp, but it directed the relevant state departments, the Department of Community Affairs and the State Planning Office, to place an immediate, indefinite hold on all non-essential discretionary funding and grant applications originating from or benefiting the Grandview Acres Special District. The reason given was a pending investigation into gross negligence, financial misallocation, and documented failure to adhere to federal non-discrimination standards, citing the new HOA complaint. The effect was immediate and crippling. The HOA was in the middle of a multi-million-dollar project to resurface the community roads and upgrade the clubhouse pool projects entirely reliant on the frozen state funds. The contractor for the road project immediately pulled out, citing the sudden funding freeze, leaving major thoroughfares half-finished and unusable. The community's meticulously planned budget was instantly reduced to zero outside of basic tax collection. Homeowners, who had previously supported Victor's tough stance on aesthetics, suddenly found themselves facing crumbling roads and a stagnant, empty pool, all because of the official action taken against their community. The residents' loyalty to Victor evaporated instantly, replaced by a volcanic fury over the collapse of their community's financial stability and their property values. The HOA board members, upon learning they faced both a federal civil rights investigation and imminent financial ruin for the community, turned on Victor with extreme prejudice. They held an emergency, unannounced meeting where Victor was unanimously voted out of his position and permanently barred from any HOA involvement. They immediately released a desperate public statement confirming the dissolution of the Compliance Committee and offering an unqualified, abject apology to Governor Vance, throwing Victor entirely under the bus. However, the apology was meaningless, the institutional damage was done. Governor Vance's ultimate act of legal retribution was cold and final. She authorized a small portion of state funds to pay for the immediate reinstallation of a new, HOA-compliant wheelchair ramp built to the highest possible standard, ensuring her safety and accessibility were restored without delay. Then, her legal team proceeded with the civil suit against Victor Sterling personally for the full cost of the replacement ramp, punitive damages related to the civil rights violation, and the emotional distress caused to her and her family. Faced with overwhelming federal evidence and the state's highest office as his opponent, Victor's legal defense crumbled. He was forced to settle, paying an enormous sum that required him to sell his own home, the home he had so aggressively sought to protect from aesthetic violations. The final irony was complete. Victor Sterling, the man who believed his HOA authority was absolute, was stripped of his position, ruined financially, and forced to leave the community he had bankrupted. The Grandview Acres community, once a beacon of aesthetic conformity, was left with half-finished roads, a stagnant budget, and the very real threat of further federal scrutiny, all because one petty tyrant deemed a governor's necessary wheelchair ramp an unacceptable disruption. The destruction of that ramp was not just an act of vandalism, it was an ignorant challenge to a political and legal authority that, unlike the HOA's rules, was backed by the full power of the state and federal government.